I don't know if Michael feels this way, but it's incredibly intimidating to speak to my faculty colleagues. So I just want to acknowledge that. And especially on this particular topic, because I know we have all done a lot of reflection on this, and I know that all of our takes on this are going to be slightly different. So I just want to begin by acknowledging that. I see myself as having I see two challenges when Dean Moore asked me to give a presentation on gospel inclusion at Luther Seminary. I immediately thought of two challenges that we're facing. Probably the most important challenge is how do we cultivate hospitality towards the new types of students that are coming to Luther, and also the new kinds of communities that they represent. So that's I think our major challenge. It's an outward focus, but that challenge is also connected with our own practices within the institution. How do we cultivate hospitality towards one another as faculty, staff, administration, and students, even amidst our various forms of difference? Now, as a way to begin, and Terry is already dealing with this, I think it's helpful for us to begin simply with acknowledgement of our shared public documents. We're all going to have different takes, different ways of interpreting and appropriating these documents in our teaching and our writing and our public speaking, but it's still helpful to acknowledge that these are some shared premises for our conversation: the mission statement, the vision statement, the welcome statement, and the theological context for that, our curriculum with its theological convictions, promise, community, neighbor, and the pedagogical strategies that we enact. This is my wording of those pedagogical strategies: living in God's word and wisdom, interpreting and confessing, leading in mission. And we've had conversations for the past few years on this. I have a copy of Dirk Lang's inaugural sermon that he gave in 2018 on how the Eucharist was a place of hospitality and of deconstructing the barriers that keep us from being one body in Christ, that this is where the heart of God, the heart of Christ is present for us. I wasn't here in the conversations that you had with Dean Boyd, but I know that you had very fruitful conversation. And then over the summer, I had a very fruitful group of students discussing Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist. Thank you for the leadership to the faculty who were involved in that. And then this morning, I would urge you all to hear Dean Moore's sermon. I've got the link here if you want to hear it. And then finally, I just want to refer to Pope Francis's Fraternity and Social Friendship as another shared document for us. In my own teaching, obviously, 2 Corinthians 5 is central to everything that I do and central to the way in which I relate our curricular strategies and our theological convictions to my own teaching. So that's one theme, and I won't spend time on this, but I know that this passage is important for all of you as well. What I want to spend time focusing on in the next few minutes is simply talking about the blessing in 2 Corinthians and relating that to some questions and stories that I have to share about my own experiences here at Luther and pedagogical processes here at Luther. And the big question that I've been wrestling with is, what does it mean to enact a pedagogy, enact patterns of learning and teaching that are centered on our being consoled in our afflictions so that we can be empowered to console those who are in any kind of affliction? So what if this is in fact central to our pedagogical practice, where pathos and parakaleo, pathos with all the multiple meanings that pathos has, and parakaleo with its multiple meanings of being both call but also consolation. And what does it mean to have pathos and affliction being enacted precisely in what we are doing, so that it's, if we are being afflicted, it is for your consolation, which you experience in the same, as you're undergoing afflictions of as well. And then there's the whole question of what does it mean to have the hope of this instruction, or the hope of our pedagogy, to actually be a koinonia in pathos and consolation. So how does this instruct us? How does this evoke our imagination when it comes to thinking about an inclusive pedagogy? And I'm just going to go really quickly because of time. Dean Moore did say 10 to 15 minutes, so I might go a little over 10. But anyway, so one of the key things in my own reflection about how this blessing informs my own teaching, one is just the premise that theology is an inherently embodied in social, cultural, political practice. And in many ways, the shift in my thinking has gone, instead of thinking that what I am doing is bringing critical perspectives or deconstructing existing practices, increasingly I'm understanding that I need to be aware that difference and suffering and even trauma are the givens, and that hope, that koinonia is the hope and promise. Do you see the shift in perspective? That koinonia cannot be assumed, that is the hope and the promise, that in many ways, that the givens are difference and suffering, and difference in power differentials as well. And so that, again, that the how of the pedagogical practice, what is actually being enacted, is an empowerment of my students, but which can only take place amidst my own suffering. And then again, the telos being that of upbuilding. What does it mean? This is what struck me about Dean Moore's sermon this morning, that she was talking about what does it mean to build just and fair institutions and empower people to do that. So, and again, this is just simply repeating the same themes, but my whole understanding of first and second order discourse has been redefined. It's not that I'm going to do away with abstraction or reflection. That's the nature of the game, of my game, but understanding theological reflection itself to be embodied, to be fraught with power differentials, to be always about relationships. So how do I understand the relationship between what we have as theologians have called first versus second order discourse, how to understand that? I just want to raise that as an issue. And now I want to tell you a story, because I want to drive that. So far I've just been talking about, nice abstractions, but I want to have this all land in a story. And now this happened during my first 5 years, sometime during my first 5 years here at Luther Seminary. And most of the people that it involves are retired, so I can talk about them behind their back. No, I'm just kidding. But we had an African-American student here at Luther, which was a rare thing in those days. And she had gone to a historically Black college, so that she had a very self-conscious awareness of her identity as an African-American. And she found Luther to be a very racist institution and to be very alienating to her own experience. But she was a very bright student, and she had good relationships with all of her faculty. So she scheduled appointments with each of us to have a conversation to help raise our consciousness about racism. And so she scheduled her appointment with me. And so she told me her story at Luther, and my response automatically was to say, yes, and let me tell you about my experience of being a woman here. I know exactly what you're talking about. And she said to me, stop right there, Dr. Malcolm. I have scheduled appointments with each of my professors, and each one has given me the same response. The Germans say that they are being persecuted by the Scandinavians. The confessionalists feel that they are being undermined by the by the process theologians and the liberals. And the liberals and process theologians feel that they are being undermined by the confessionalists. The pietists and the confessionalists feel that they're being victimized by each other. The contemporary worship people feel victimized by the traditional worship people, and vice versa. Why do you all have the same story? And as I have reflected on that story over the years, I've used that story as a tool for my own sort of critical self-awareness. I think we're at a different place in this institution, but I just want to mention the things that come to mind to me from this story. A lack of awareness of our social, political, and cultural location, a refusal to be cognizant of the actual power dynamics at work, the assumption of sameness and similarity with our student, and an erasure of the very different experience that she was trying to bring to our attention, a refusal to recognize our complicity in racism. And then probably I hope this is changing, but I think at Luther Seminary, we all have a narrative of being victimized, which means that we can't really attend to the unique ways that the others in our midst may be victimized by our own behavior. And then we view other people's stories of victimization as potential tools in our own power struggles. And then just the general disconnect between our theological ideas and our capacity for any kind of critical self-awareness, especially with regard to what she was trying to tell us that was different from what we had already assumed. So now, fast forward 2 decades later. Okay, so what are some of the questions that we're facing today? I had a lot of stories, I had a lot more planned, but my time is up. So I'm just going to raise the 2 basic issues that I think we're facing in terms of our pedagogy, our relationships with one another, especially as we are learning to become more attentive to the new types of students that are in our midst and the new types of communities that they are going to be leading. So one big question simply has to do with self-reflexivity. How do we teach and learn that include not just our students being transformed by our teaching, but are being transformed by what our students are telling us about who our students are? How do we become aware of our performative contradictions between what we say and what we actually do? I have all sorts of examples for each of these in stories, but I don't have time for that. I can talk about that in my small groups. We have no other choice. I've had recent conversation with Rolf about this in relation to a class I'm teaching, but we have no other choice but to be who we are. But how do we become self-conscious of our own trigger points? There's some kinds of students we have affinities with. There are others that we don't have affinities with. How do we become aware of our own trigger points? And how do we attend to our responsibility to the range of students that we teach? I mean, in my case, my trigger points are Gen X males and baby boomer males. I connect with my women students and my students of color and my international students. So those are the students that, even though I, have abstractions, and even though I lecture too much and all of that, there's an emotional connection there, whereas I don't feel the connection as much. And so that's where I get triggered. And then the other comment I just want to make is that we are going to fail at this, and we need one another to help one another become aware of who we are. And then this last piece is simply the piece about the relationship between deconstruction and upbuilding, because those are the 2 tasks that are central to what we're doing. On the one hand, we no longer look at one another from a human point of view, so that deconstruction and dismantling are part and parcel of what we're about. But at the same time, that is for the sake of upbuilding, especially in a time where institutions, not just the ecclesial institutions, but the very institutions that undergirded democracy are in question, from our legal institutions to our understanding of science and so forth. So how do we understand our role? How do we understand the relationship between deconstruction and upbuilding? I just wanted to say one final comment, which is that when I look at the different Facebook posts of my students, and I know many of you share the same friends on Facebook, there's a difference between what my white students post and what my African American students post. All of my students do social political commentary, but what's interesting is that my African American students, even my younger African American males, have more about self-empowerment, their self-empowerment as African American males or as African American women. And so the question that raises for me is, what is my role in this task of upbuilding and empowerment, especially in relation to their needs? And the fact, of course, that some students do not need empowerment. Some students need, different students are going to need different things. And then finally, the last piece is I just want to end with Isaiah 61, which again, in many ways resonates with Dean Moore's sermon this morning. So I would urge you to listen to that sermon. But what does it mean for us to, in fact, enable our students to be oaks of righteousness who are going to be rebuilding ruined cities? And what does it mean for us to understand our task as being part of the task of empowering them to build up ancient ruins and repair ruined cities? So I'll stop there. Sorry,
That's fantastic, Lois. You always bring the Holy Spirit power. So I'm always blessed to be able to work with you, my friend. Actually, just want to say a word of gratitude to both Luis and Lois. It's such a blessing to minister with these two sisters, and grateful for their presence and their voice in our institution. I don't have a PowerPoint, just the words. So I hope that that's acceptable. This was a really challenging talk to write, to come up with it, for just a whole bunch of different reasons. And so I hope that what you hear will, that you'll feel the care and compassion and love that went into it, as imperfect as I'm sure it's going to be. And it really came out more like a letter. So, it is what it is. So dear colleagues, I've been asked to offer a few reflections in response to the prompt, what do we mean by a gospel-centered community of inclusion? And again, I want to thank my two sisters, Luis and Lois, for their contributions thus far. For me, the words gospel and inclusion sit uncomfortably next to one another in the aforementioned prompt. But why? Not because inclusion is an ignoble or unworthy value. Inclusion of the neighbor is something to strive for here at Luther, and most especially in our life together as a learning community. Gospel and inclusion are uncomfortable for me, an uncomfortable pair for me, because inclusion is far too tame a word to describe our God-given call to one another, to our students, and to our church. Inclusion might lead us to hire more diverse faculty, and this is great. Inclusion might lead us to integrate more diverse voices into our syllabi, and this is laudatory. Inclusion might lead us to make a more deliberate effort to recruit a diverse student base, and this is both commendable and crucial. And on all of these fronts, we as an institution have actually made progress that I want to recognize, celebrate, and express gratitude for, even while noting that these advances have really only taken us a few steps on a long and really what is a multi-generational journey. But Jesus' call to Luther Seminary is something much more dangerous and far more costly than inclusion. Jesus calls us to love, and when love shows up, so do a whole bunch of other problems. The biggest problem with love is that it leads us to our deaths. Love leads to the cross. So from Matthew 16, then Jesus told his disciples, if any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. Inclusion, or maybe to riff a bit on Paul, inclusion without love is nothing. Quote, if I speak in the tongues of mortals and of angels, but do not have love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give away all my possessions, and if I hand over my body so that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing, unquote. If we are inclusive but have not love, we are nothing more than hollow clamor in an escalating and cacophonous culture war. We may be flying the right flag, but inside the building, our anthem will ring hollow. In John 13, Jesus speaks these words, I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. My friend and colleague Caroline, who I don't think is here, but she'll correct me if I mess that up. My friend and colleague Caroline isn't here to confirm my hermeneutical suspicions, but I'm assuming that for the disciples, these words took on a more ominous significance in chapter 20 than they did in chapter 13. The call to love one another is the call to die, to our bigotry, to our resentment, to our tribalism, to our racism, to petty grievances, to our cowardice, to our sexism, to our envy, to insecurities that prevent us from doing what is right, to bearing false witness against our neighbors through gossip and slander, to using power and privilege as a shield from responsibility, to opting out of the community's life when our argument hasn't been adopted, and most especially to the love-stifling demons of despair and cynicism. Tooth and nail, our old Adam and old Eve fight the summons to the cross. But in a nod to Mandalorian season 2, right, this is the way. The command to love one another is a heavy and maybe even an impossible lift, and yet the command remains. And so the only place I know to go is the place of prayer, where we can intercede at the mercy seat of the one whose love for the world overcame sin, death, and the devil. My prayer is that the Lord of life would cause the fruit of love to grow bountifully on our tree. The fruit of love cannot be accomplished in committees, and it can't be achieved through strategic planning, and it won't even spring forth from 10,000 faculty retreats, irrespective of how much wine is involved in them. It's a gift of the Spirit and the overflowing consequence of the chain-breaking power of the gospel. I care deeply for this community for both personal and professional reasons. It's nurtured my own faith. It helped free my own wife from the chains of depression and has even helped raise our daughters. But so often when it comes to our life together as faculty, we are, I'm sad to say, a noisy gong and a clanging cymbal. My prayer is that the Good Shepherd would not only help us to be inclusive, but much more dangerously enable us to love. Thanks.